the Tudors. If you've given your heart to this series, you're in the right place. But remember, what you saw on screen wasn't always the truth. Let's uncover together where fact ends and fiction begins. Your response to part 1 was incredible, so here's part 2 as promised. Today, let's uncover the truth about Anne Boleyn's family and separate fact from the series fiction. If you enjoy this content, your likes would mean a lot. So, let's begin with Anne Boleyn's mother, Elizabeth Boleyn, née Howard. In the series, she simply doesn't appear at all, not even once. Yet in real life, she was quite close to Anne and was present at many key events in her daughter's life and at court in general. To start with, she likely served as a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon and was present at Catherine's coronation with Henry, just as she later attended Anne's coronation. She also accompanied her daughter Anne and King Henry VIII in 1529 when they went to inspect York Place after the king announced it would be renamed Whitehall. She even lived there with Anne before Anne became queen. By the way, there's another inaccuracy in the series related to Whitehall. It's shown as Henry VIII's residence from the very start, but in fact, he didn't acquire it until Cardinal Wolsey's downfall. Anne's love for her mother came through clearly in the words she spoke to Sir William Kingston upon arriving at the Tower after her arrest on May 2nd, 1536. "Oh, my mother, you will die of sorrow." So it seems Anne was quite close to her mother, closer in fact than to her sister Mary. Omitting such an important female figure from the series strikes me as a rather careless decision. Now, let's talk about Anne's father, Thomas Boleyn. In the series, he's arguably portrayed as one of the main villains, obsessed only with pushing his daughters into the king's bed. But what if I show you another side of him, and prove that much of this image is shaped by films and TV, while the real Thomas Boleyn was a very successful courtier, long before Mary ever shared the king's bed? I don't want to make empty claims, so here are just a few of his career highlights. He accompanied Margaret Tudor to Scotland for her wedding, which shows Henry VII, Henry VIII's father, trusted him. Henry VIII himself appointed him Keeper of the Foreign Exchange in Calais in 1509 and knighted him. He was also sent on a diplomatic mission to the court of Margaret of Austria. By the early 1520s, Thomas was already one of the most respected courtiers at Henry's court. He owned more than 24 estates, served as treasurer of the household, and carried out numerous important diplomatic assignments. You might say, serving at court is one thing, but having your daughter become Queen of England is quite another. Yes, a new marriage to the king was definitely a social elevator for the whole family, but even without it, Thomas was doing quite well. Here's another argument against the idea that Thomas was simply a scheming pander. He actively opposed Anne's marriage to Henry VIII. In 1533, Imperial Ambassador Eustace Chapuis recorded that Thomas Boleyn tried to dissuade Henry from marrying Anne. Chapuis also wrote that Anne was furious with both her father and her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, for opposing the match. In exploring the real character of Thomas, it's important to say that he was an enlightened man, what we might now call open-minded. He valued education not only for his son, but also for his daughters, which was quite rare at the time. Unlike Jane Seymour, who could barely write, Thomas ensured that Anne and Mary received an excellent education, preparing them for life at highly competitive European courts. His household was a centre of intellectual life, and he supported some of the brightest minds of his era. One of the main criticisms of Thomas is that he abandoned Anne and George during their arrest and execution in 1536. But it must be said that by then, he really couldn't help them, though it seems he didn't try very hard either. For example, there is a surviving letter from the father of Thomas Wyatt, who was also imprisoned at that time in the Tower, pleading for his son's pardon. We have no evidence of any such letter or public plea from Thomas Boleyn. Perhaps Thomas knew Henry too well and realised there was no chance. By the way, that's another error in the series. It suggests that Thomas himself was imprisoned in the Tower at the same time. He wasn't. And another popular myth is that Anne Boleyn watched her brother's execution from her window. In reality, the rooms where she was held faced the other side. Moreover, the final days of Anne's imprisonment in the Tower are extremely well documented, and if she had witnessed the execution from her window, there would almost certainly be records of it. In any case, Thomas continued serving Henry VIII until his own death in 1539 and remained at court. So what's your view of him? Was he a villain, or just another victim of Henry VIII? Let's talk about Anne's brother, George Boleyn, and his sexual orientation, as depicted in The Tudors, which can safely be considered another invention of the show's writers. In the series, he's portrayed as a bisexual man who has relationships with both men and women. In reality, there were no rumours about George's sexual orientation, neither during his lifetime nor at the time of his death. None of the men accused alongside Anne were charged with sodomy. The idea of his homosexuality actually began with an article by historian Raytha Warnaker in the 1980s. It was based on the fact that George once gave Mark Smeaton a book that mocked the institution of marriage. As for his relationship with his wife and that disturbing scene of their wedding night, first of all, there's another chronological inaccuracy. The series shows George Boleyn marrying when Anne is already queen, around 1535. In reality, George had been married since around 1525. We know relatively little about what their relationship was actually like. However, some historians, most notably Alison Weir, argue that it was Jane who testified that her husband committed incest with his sister, and that she also shared certain extremely sensitive and likely false details with the investigators. So, while we can't say much with certainty, it seems safe to say their marriage was probably not a very happy one. And although George doesn't get much screen time in The Tudors, he was in fact a truly fascinating figure of his era. It seems he was taken quite seriously at the royal court, as well as at foreign courts. George Boleyn followed in his father's footsteps by becoming a diplomat, undertaking several important missions to France. In official records from one of his trips to France, he was described as someone the king especially loves and trusts. Henry also asked George Boleyn to argue in Parliament for royal supremacy over the church. In 1533, George had the highest attendance record of any lord in Parliament. George was also a passionate reformer, something reflected in the speech he gave before his execution. A speech reduced in the series to just 2 lines. He was a poet and notable patron of the arts, and overall an exceptional character, much like the rest of the Boleyn family. And now, saving the most interesting for last, Mary, Anne's sister. In the series, she's shown as quite a promiscuous woman, a reputation she owes not only to the show's producers, but also to Catholic propaganda of the time. Since Anne was deeply disliked in the Catholic world for many reasons, some of that notoriety spread to her sister as well. Mary was rumoured to have had an affair with King of France, and in the series, there's that line where Francis points Mary out to Henry, calling her his English mare he likes to ride. There are really only 3 pieces of evidence that might refer to Mary Boleyn's alleged sexual adventures in France. The first is a statement from a Catholic bishop, claiming that Francis told him Mary was a great and infamous whore. The other 2 sources are books, but in those it is actually Anne who is mentioned in that context, not Mary. So, the series' portrayal of Mary in this respect is definitely exaggerated. But here you might ask, what about her relationship with Henry? They really did have an affair. We know this only because when Henry VIII wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, he petitioned for a dispensation to remove the obstacle of affinity arising from illicit intercourse in any degree, even the first. Historians still debate exactly how long it lasted. So yes, there is definitely a stain on Mary's reputation. But again, it's simply not comparable to the way she's portrayed in the series. In fact, Mary remains quite a mysterious figure, since far less information about her has survived compared to other members of the family. By the way, the film The Other Boleyn Girl took the most liberties with her story, mixing together ideas like A Child by Henry, guardianship of Elizabeth after Anne's death, and much, much more. So, if you'd like me to make a similar video about that film, let me know in the comments. And also, share your thoughts on the entire Boleyn family. Were they all power-hungry, ambitious courtiers, or simply people trying to survive as best they could in the complex world of the Tudor court, playing and losing their own version of the Game of Thrones?